Hell's Angels, the most well-known of the biker gangs. Angels were led by Ralph Sonny Barger, and not so well known is that he was reportedly an informant for the Oakland Police Department and also on the payroll of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
Jane Mansfield was an actress, sex symbol, and involved with the Church of Satan. Killed in a car wreck, survived by her children. Her daughter said Mansfield parties featured the rich and famous, filming themselves during sex orgies. The beautiful and innocent-looking Sharon Tate and her husband, Roman Polanski, were alleged producers and collectors of the famed porn as well. Robert F. Kennedy, U.S. Senator and presidential candidate, was assassinated in Hollywood on June 5, 1968. Kennedy was allegedly shot from point-blank range behind his right ear by Sirhan Sirhan, who was standing several yards in front of and to the left of the candidate.
Without further ado, we begin this journey with Phil Hartman, who was a high school friend of Lynette Squeaky Fromme, who later became a disciple of Charlie Manson. She was also a jailhouse correspondent with John Hinckley, and the attempted assassin of President Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was once a roommate of modeling entrepreneur Harry Conover, whose wife was the infamous Candy Jones, who was treated by CIA-linked hypnotist William Jennings Bryan. Bryan also treated the purported Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, whose name was written repetitively throughout the diaries of Sirhan Sirhan, who was also treated by Bryan. Bryan, who served as a technical director on The Manchurian Candidate, which was directed by John Frankenheimer, at whose beach house a dinner was held on June 5, 1968, whose attendees included Mama Cass Elliot, Roman Polanski, and Sharon Tate, who was killed just over a year later by followers of Charlie Manson, whose music was recorded by Doris Day's son, a music producer named Terry Melcher, who lived with his girlfriend, Candace Bergen, at Celio Drive, the year before it became a slaughterhouse after being rented by Polanski, who initially was slated to pen the screenplay for Day of the Dolphin, which purported to tell the story of Dr. John Lilly, who was a friend of Timothy Leary, whose Mellon family-owned Millbrook estate was frequently visited by Dr. Max Feelgood Jacobson, who once treated Judy Garland and who served as the personal physician of John F. Kennedy, whose assassination prompted the shelving of the film The Manchurian Candidate.
The film was shelved by its star, Frank Sinatra, who was a frequent companion of fellow Brat Packer Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis, who was an acknowledged member of Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, from where Manson recruited killers Bobby Cupid Beausoleil and Susan Sexy Sadie Atkins. Atkins, who confessed to her cellmates that she had stabbed to death actress Sharon Tate. Tate was inducted into witchcraft on the set of the Polanski-directed film The Fearless Vampire Killers by Alexander King of the Witches Saunders. Saunders, who received witchcraft training as a child from Aleister Crowley. Crowley, whose followers included Anton LaVey and fellow Church of Satan member Kenneth Anger. Anger, who was a roommate and probable lover of family member Bobby Beausoleil. Bobby Beausoleil, who once appeared in an underground film titled Mondo Hollywood, which also featured hairdresser and Manson victim Jay Sebring. Sebring, who was a former lover of Sharon Tate, and Sharon Tate, who was a friend of a wealthy widow named Charlene Kafritz, who played host to and filmed the exploits of Charlie and some of his girls, who also lived for a time with Beach Boy Dennis Wilson. Wilson, who recorded a song penned by Charlie, who was an occasional member of the entourage of Mama Cass. Mama Cass was listed as a defense witness for Charlie's trial, but never called, as was her Mamas and the Papas bandmate John Phillips. John Phillips was close to Roman Polanski, Sharon Tate, Terry Melcher, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Cass Elliot, and film producer Robert Evans. Robert Evans was working with and very likely contracted the execution killing of Roy Radin. Radin, whose assistant was Michael DeVinco, aka Mickey Deans, who married Wizard of Oz star Judy Garland just a few months before her untimely death. Judy Garland, as a teen, was flooded with phone messages and telegrams by admirer Oscar Levant. Levant, whose dead body was found by Candace Bergen. Bergen, who, as a photojournalist for Life magazine, covered the preempted presidential campaign of Robert Kennedy. Kennedy was romantically linked to Marilyn Monroe. Monroe was discovered by Anton LaVey, and Anton LaVey appeared in Kenneth Anger's Invocation of My Demon Brother, released in August of 1969, along with Bobby Beausoleil, Mick Jagger, and Keith Richards. Richards, who was a guest at the 1968 London wedding of Sharon Tate to Roman Polanski. Roman Polanski, who, during a nude photo shoot, molested a 13-year-old girl.
This shocking incident took place in the home of Jack Nicholson, who was also a friend of Cass Elliot, as were Robert Evans and Manson victims Jay Sebring, Wojtek Frykowski, and Abigail Folger, who provided funding for the Himalayan Academy, which Kenneth Anger helped form with Timothy Leary, who was on the side of the stage at the 1969 Altamont concert, where, while the Rolling Stone played the processed church-inspired Sympathy for the Devil, a fan was killed on film by the Hells Angels, who had been romanticized and transformed into anti-establishment heroes in the film Scorpio Rising by Kenneth Anger and the book Hells Angels by Hunter S. Thompson, both of which have been accused of making snuff films for private collectors, which is also a favorite pastime of Charlie Manson, one of whose underage recruits was Dee Dee Lansbury, who had written permission to travel with Charlie from her mother, Angela Lansbury. Angela Lansbury, who starred as the control agent in The Manchurian Candidate, which was based on the novel of the same name by Richard Condon, who once served as a publicist for Walt Disney. Walt Disney, who once owned the home where the Manson family slaughtered Lino LaBianca and wife Rosemary, who was involved in the trafficking of drugs, as were many in this twisted saga, including victims Wojtek Frykowski and Abigail Folger, as well as John Phillips and Kenneth Anger. Kenneth Anger was a huge fan of the dark and violent imagery of the Rosicrucian-inspired L. Frank Baum-penned Oz books, which inspired the band The Magic Powerhouse of Oz, led by Bobby Beausoleil, who was at one time in the band Love with Arthur Lee, four of whose members later turned up dead or missing, as did Charlene Caffrey. Cass Elliot, who allegedly choked on a sandwich in '74, Dennis Wilson, who allegedly drowned on December 28, '83, and Graham Parsons, whose corpse was stolen and burned at the Joshua Tree at the autumn equinox of '73 by his band's road manager, Phil Kaufman, who was a good friend from prison of Charlie Manson, who met at Cass Elliot's house and received money from victim Abigail Folger, who also funded Kenneth Anger, who at various times lived with Jimmy Page, who purchased Crowley's home and many of his artifacts, and Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg, whose home in '79 yielded the body of a teenager who had been shot to death, as was John Lennon the next year by Mark David Chapman, who, shortly before doing so, met and offered a gift of live bullets to Kenneth Anger.